Probably in terms of writing and linguistic awareness, they were a combination, firstly, of W's, P.G. Wodehouse, Oscar Wilde, and Evelyn Waugh, the British novelist. That's a male Evelyn, by the way. And I would add to that Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. When I was between the ages of about 7 and 12, I was obsessed with Sherlock Holmes, and I would read and reread and reread all those. So the rhythms and tones of the English language, as exemplified by that kind of grand, perfect Victorian manner, and then Dickens. But it was really Oscar Wilde who awoke language in my head in a way like nobody else. And I think also discovering the kind of man Oscar Wilde was an enormous influence as well. The fact that you could be such a towering intellect, such a lord of language, and be charming and graceful, kind, good-natured, but also unhappy and unlucky, was a great discovery for an adolescent, because one of the traps of adolescence is the sort of paranoid resentment that somehow you're never going to match up, and that everybody else's life is going to be better and finer and fuller, that everyone else attended some secret lesson in which how to live was taught, and you had a dental appointment that day, or you were somehow not invited. And the point of great writers like Wilde is that they make that invitation to you. They welcome you. Perhaps the greatest definition, I think, of character and quality is people who, when they're truly great, rather than making you feel that tall, they make you feel that tall. That their greatness, as it were, improves you. They used to say of Oscar Wilde that when you got down from a dinner table, you felt funnier and wittier and cleverer. Now, a lot of brilliant people make you feel less funny, less clever, less witty, because they're so clever, witty, and funny. But he had the opposite effect. A bit like what Shakespeare said about Falstaff. Not just a wit, but a cause of wit in others. Philosophy is an odd thing. When we use the word in everyday speech, you sometimes hear it hilariously. They say, it's never good to be late. That's my philosophy. You think that's a generous ascription of that rather dull precept to call it a philosophy. But it's odd how philosophers, generally speaking, at least the ones I've read or the ones I value, don't have, in that sense, a philosophy. There is no particular Socratic or Nietzschean or Kantian way to live your life. They don't offer ethical codes and standards by which to live your life. They don't offer a philosophy to follow. They just simply raise an enormous number of questions, mostly. So in the sense that you put the question, is there a philosopher that's important to me? Well, I loved really the sort of Bertrand Russell grand sort of tour of philosophy, the history of philosophy from the pre-Socratics, as they're called, Zeno and so on, through to Socrates and Plato and then Aristotle. I never quite liked Aristotle. I think that's partly, although he was obviously a genius and a brilliant, and he invented logic, so what's not to like? I think it was his influence on the medieval mind was probably rather pernicious and unfortunate, and all those categories and things. But when it opened up with, I suppose, Spinoza but then Kant really in the Enlightenment era. Oh, and actually Locke, I did like Locke. He was a fine philosopher. But they don't, what's so great about them is that they just, they're quite scary when you think of the word philosopher, and especially if it's logic and symbolic logic, and you get onto Hegelian philosophy. It's incredibly difficult to read, I find, and you follow for about, it's like trying to grab a salmon, the harder you clutch at it, the more it slips out of your hand, and whoa, it's gone, and you chase it again, and what was that? And you feel very stupid. But I think the beauty of questioning and simplicity that you get from Kant in particular, I think, is just amazing, because it's like they say of simple mathematical laws, that make fractals. The tiniest little elegant observation about or question about something just spins out these immensely complex things that make you rethink everything. So yes, I think philosophy is a really important dimension, but I think in our age we tend to be rather sloppy about it. We either think Buddhism is philosophy, which, you know, or some sort of Eastern thing about being nice and spiritual, and that'll do, which is fine. I mean, you know, obviously I believe in kindness and niceness and lots of spiritual things, but the real intellectual rigor and quest of logic is something that I'm afraid takes incredibly hard work. And we live in an age in which hard work is, if not actively deprecated or denigrated, it is run away from or ignored. It's sort of, people frown at you and say, well, that's a bit dull and stupid. Why can't we just short circuit it and talk about, like, spirit? Well, yeah, you can say spirit, but if you think that's philosophy, and if you think that's good enough, the most important philosophy, I think, is that even if it isn't true, you must absolutely assume there is no afterlife. You cannot for 1 second, I think, abrogate the responsibility of believing that this is it. Because if you think you're going to have an eternity in which you can talk to Mozart and Schopenhauer on a cloud and learn stuff and, you know, really get to grips with knowledge and understanding, and so you won't bother now, I think it's a terrible mistake. It may be that there is an afterlife and I'll look incredibly stupid, but at least I would have had a crammed pre-afterlife, a crammed life. So to me, the most important thing is, you know, as Kipling put it, you know, to fill every 60 seconds with, no, what is it? To fill every unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, you know, absolutely. So that's all I'm saying, I suppose, is that there's no point wasting time being lazy. Though, of course, indolence in a divine way, axidy, has its advantages. Oh, shut up, Steve. Okay. I came from a what on the surface would have looked like a very typical English family, in as much as, I say typical, one that an American might regard as typical. It was a country house with gardeners and nice staff, and it looked rather grand. And I was sent away at the age of 7 to a prep school, which is in England is from 7 to 13 is a prep school, and sent away to boarding school 200 miles from home. And that's was a very traditional English, what you might call upper class, upper middle class sort of education, where I received a very classical education. My parents were marvellously educated people. They're both university educated, both brilliant scholars in their own way. My father a physicist, my mother a historian, but not absolutely typical of the class, because my mother's family is Jewish, Eastern European Jewish, and she was actually born in Britain, but her sister was born in the family area, which is now Slovakia, but which was Hungary and indeed for a short time Czechoslovakia. And so there was that sort of mixture, that rather exotic mixture, the mother's family of people who talked about food, which is a very un-English thing to do back in the 60s when I was growing up, and who had that kind of exotic accent and all those things. But they weren't Judaic, they weren't religiously Jewish, they were just proud to be Jewish Jews, and there were plenty of them in Israel. Those who'd survived the Holocaust were in Israel, or mostly in America. And so, in that sense, it was an idyllic childhood. If you love me looking at the house and looking at how lucky we were, it looks fantastic. But of course, the childhood is what goes on inside your head, not nothing to do with what goes on outside. So it was the usual sticky mess of adolescent Sturm und Drang. Always closest to my mother, because my mother is an extraordinarily warm and unbelievably friendly and lovable person. People are genuinely astounded by her positivity. She's just the most smiling person people will have met. And so that, you know, obviously gave closest warmth. And my father was rather remote. I thought of him, I wrote about this in my autobiography, that I thought of him as Sherlock Holmes. He was similarly a deeply rational man, unbelievably brilliant, because of his physics and his mathematics, and also music. He was as a young boy, he was a chorister at St Paul's Cathedral, and he played the piano beautifully, and his musical understanding was very fine, and but very a sort of great intellectual rigor. He seemed to us as children, to my brother and my sister and myself, as quite cold and quite forbidding, quite frightening. He worked incredibly hard. He worked at home. The stable block of the family house, which was a very large stable block indeed, was he converted to his laboratories where he worked, and so he we never had the pleasure of him being out of the house, and or he was inside the house in his study working, and we never quite knew where he was, and if we made a noise, we felt the sort of thunder rumbling. So he was quite a scary man. Now, of course, on very easy and fine terms, but it was a difficult thing. What makes a good family? Well, I suppose, well, obviously love. Love lubricated often, I think, by humour. I think a family that can laugh at each other and that tease themselves and who are able to be jolly with each other, I think is the key. Humour is like a dog's tongue, or a dog's nose rather, should be cold and faintly wet, and a vet will tell you that's a sign of a healthy dog. I think our equivalent of a cold, wet nose is humour. Families where there's not much laughter, I think, are signs of some sort of dysfunctionality or sickness. Maybe if there's too much laughter, it's dysfunctional too. Who knows? Families are so different. I've never met anyone who says that they come from they thought they lived in a normal family. As children, everyone thinks their family is weird and they're upset by the weirdness of their own family. It is a peculiar thing we're asked to do. That I think G.K. Chesterton put it that it is an onerous responsibility that, having been dropped by the stork down a random chimney and unwrapped, we are invited to get on with a set of strangers who peer down at us. I mean, because although yes, we share the DNA, they are physically of our flesh and we are of their flesh. Nonetheless, we didn't choose them. They are a set of strangers. There's this man here, and we should call him Daddy, and there's this woman here, we should call her Mummy. This girl here, I should call my sister, and this boy here, I should call my brother, and we are somehow bonded for life. I remember making an absolute, well, I won't say fool of myself. I was expelled from a meeting of Latter-day Saints when I first went to Salt Lake City. I just literally, as a tourist, and I was wandering around, and this person in a grey shift came up to me and said, "Would you like to see around?" And I said, "Well, that's very kind." And then she started gathering others, and I realised she was a Mormon who was doing a tour, and presumably there was a little bit of recruitment going along, because they're a very proselytizing sect, as you know, the Mormons. Anyway, but she gave us a good tour, and we saw this tabernacle here and this here and so on. And then at one point she said, "I just want to tell you a little about the Church of Latter-day Saints," and we all politely stood. And then she said how in the afterlife all families will be reunited, and you'll be with your families forever. So I put my hand up and said, "Well, what happens if you've been good?" She said, "Could you leave, please?" Because everyone started laughing. But I mean, what a ridiculous idea! How is that supposed to be attractive? That you're going to be stuck with every aunt and every cousin and every, oh, good gracious, every, alcoholic or slightly deviant uncle. I mean, Jesus, it's just the most awful destiny imaginable. And they think that's a USP. That's what our church promises. Good Lord. Well, of course, what it does, you don't have to be that smart to spot, is what it does is that church focuses entirely on women d'un certain âge, as the French say, women of a certain age, who have lost their children because they've grown up, and who've lost their parents because they've died, and they're lonely, and they've still got that family queen bee mother nesting instinct, and they're the ones the Latter-day Saints home in on and say, "You follow us, and we promise you that you'll be your family all around you again in heaven." And they think that's a cool thing. Everyone else would go, "Ah!" Anyway. I say, and I think it's true, that for me the first moment with Oscar was language. I was youngish, 11ish, 12ish, too young really to be entirely sure of my sexuality, of what that sexuality meant. I think I've always been aware of my sexuality, but I never quite knew what it meant. But so that side of him we'll come on to. But first it was language, and I remember there's a line of Algernon's in The Importance of Being Earnest, and I was watching the Puffin Asquith film of The Importance of Being Earnest. And Algernon says to Cicely, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection? And I leaned forward, and there were no videos and instant pauses on TiVo in those days, and I replayed it in my brain. Would you be offended if I said that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection? And I thought, how unbelievably beautiful, the swing, the balance, the rhythm, how clever to make a sentence that's all full of Latinate words ending in ation, to make that sing and poetical, because mostly in the English language the words that are lyrical and beautiful are not words like the personification. They're rather technical, clumpy words, but just simply by colliding them together, it's funny and beautiful and breathtaking. And I'd known that you could use language to say, can I be excused, I need to go to the men's room. I knew that you could use language to say, I want some more. I knew that language had that function, but the idea that it could be used to dance, that it could be used to delight, that it could be used to enthrall quite so magnificently was new to me. So I read, we had, right in the country, the library would come and visit us. It was what's called a mobile library. It's like a big van, and it would come about, half a mile from the house and walk down a country lane to where it used to stop, and it would get in, and that's where I get all my books. So I said, do you have any Oscar Wilde? And they said, yes. I said, I want a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And they said, yes, I think we've heard of that one. And then get it to me, and I'm saying it's there in front of me. And I read it, and I kind of learn the whole play off by heart. I mean, I can still to this day. Did you hear what I was playing on the piano just now? I didn't think it polite to listen, sir, and so on. That's how the play begins. I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play the piano well. Anyone can play the piano well, but I play with wonderful expression, and so on. Anyway, I just became obsessed. And then I saw a biography by a man called Montgomery Hyde of Wilde, so I read the biography. And this is where it all changed, because not only was this man, as I said before, a lord of language. It's a phrase of his own, actually, of his own. But he was, if you like, a kind of secular messiah, a bohemian prince of the most fantastic power and beauty and grace and gravity, and he collected friends, and he looked at the world and he showed you the true colours of things as no one had. And on top of that, he shared what I knew instinctively was my sexual preference for my own kind. And not only that, but it caused, of course, him the most appalling suffering. He was despised and rejected of men in the most terrible way. And then when I read De Profundis, the letter he wrote to Lord Alfred from Reading Jail, I think it was perhaps one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. Now, of course, like a lot of people in my generation, that meant I grew up with a sense of doom being allied to sexuality. That there were no literature and biography offered no examples of happy endings for homosexual people. Gay wasn't used then. So I had an immense and obvious sense of the fact that my life would be doomed, would be fatal, and would probably end in prison or in shame and something horrible. But the knowledge that I would be joining Oscar Wilde, and then after that, of course, through bibliographies, you find out other people, André Gide or whoever, Michelangelo. I would be joining a kind of Olympia of fabulous men and women who were better than others. They had a special insight. They vibrated at art and beauty with a sort of greater frequency and gave off a more wonderful harmonic than most people did. And so I was proud to be an elect, even if it was a doomed elect. That was my sentimental and adolescent, I suppose, response to my sexuality. I can't imagine how different it would have been if I'd been born 20 years later and into a world of the internet and much more open things. I'm sure it would have been a lot less doom-laden, but I suspect I would have read a lot less literature, and I would have been a lot less interested in the intellect and the life of the mind. I would have been much more interested in just getting my rocks off, I suppose, because it would have been easier to do so, I guess. I would have been felt less guilty for so long. There are compensations, though, for the era in which I grew up, and that is, as I say, the fellowship of literature. Yes, I never thought, of course, when I grew up loving Wilde and collecting his books and even trying to collect early editions, that that I would one day play him on screen. It was simply unthinkable, but it did come to pass. I became aware as I entered my 30s that it was just being, shall we say, was disposed to the adipose. I was getting a little plump. That I could, if I grew my hair, look a little like him. And although that is completely irrelevant basis on which to be qualified to play someone, it just sets the thing in your mind. And the English playwright Alan Bennett once stopped me in Joe Allen's in London, just as he was passing the table. And he said, "I was looking at you from across the room, and it suddenly occurred to me, you look terribly like Oscar, you know. You should play him one day." And I thought, I went to the gents and I looked in the mirror and I thought, gosh. And I didn't really think much more of it. And occasionally people would use that tediously predictable phrase, "born to be wild." And then suddenly I was approached by Julian Mitchell, the writer, and Brian Gilbert, the director, and Mark Samuelson, the producer, who had this project, and saying, would I play Oscar Wilde? And it was overwhelming. And what was even more overwhelming was they had as a consultant this wonderful, charming man called Merlin Holland, who was Oscar's grandson, who was younger than Wilde was when Wilde died. And that connects us to it. It just so happens that Wilde's younger son, Vivian Holland, married very, very late and had a very late child, and hence Wilde's grandson lived, you know, as I say, was in 100 years after Wilde was Wilde's age, which is rare. So anyway, that seemed so exciting and marvelous, and I prepared it. I read as much as I could, of course, but nothing can prepare you for the I don't know, every day getting up and worrying about whether or not you're going to let him down. I mean, the one thing I was absolutely determined was that that Wilde was not just a sort of epigram factory, just a machine for spouting bon mots and witticisms in a camp, brittle, peacocky manner, going, oh, how too utterly utter. That everyone who described him described the mellow gravity of his voice, the seriousness with which he looked into your eyes, which is what made him so funny, because he, you know, everything he said was said as if it was absolutely true. So when it was a dazzling paradox or a marvelous aphoristic turn of phrase, literal turn of phrase, you know, where the thing is inverted, you know, like, you know, work is the curse of the drinking classes. He didn't say it in inverted commas as if he knew it were a joke. He said it as if he had just seen it as a truth. And that made it funnier, but it was also part of his whole manner, is that there was a direct simplicity about him, not an arch campness, which is... So even if I was hopeless, I hoped the one thing I could set straight about Wilde was that. So that was a heck of a feeling. Another side to him is, of course, naturally people think of him as a gay martyr and a gay icon and a gay symbol for the age, but he was a marvellous father until he wasn't, until, of course, he created such a scandal, or it was embroiled in such a scandal that obviously was disastrous for his family, and that betrayal was not a piece of good fatherhood. But while he was a father, he was a kindly father, a loving father, and he created one of the greatest gifts to children that there ever was, which is his fairy stories, which I don't think are well known enough. I think they rank absolutely with the Grimm fairy stories and the Hans Christian Andersen fairy stories. They're marvellous tales. They have all his qualities and something extra. Greatness of heart and a beauty and a charm and an amazing, I think the word is proleptic, a sort of prophetic vision almost of what suffering and pain and sacrifice he would go through, although they were written at the height of his happiness and his riches and his popularity. There is a sort of doom in the way the stories play out, which is quite staggeringly, as I say, proleptic. I suppose, I mean, yes, Wilde teaches as much that even from 120 years in the past seems as true as ever it was. He wrote marvellously in his essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, about the press. In medieval times, they had the rack. Now we have the press. I think he predicted really quite brilliantly the enormous growth of the press, the impertinence of the press, how wrong it was that the emphasis on the press was on the individual lives of private people rather than on sharing truth and beauty and innovation. And I'm afraid I don't really enjoy the press at all. I like to know what's going on in the world, but that's a very small part of what the press delivers. So I haven't read a newspaper for 15 years, I think 12 years certainly, certainly not a British one. I just don't, and I find I get on with them without them incredibly well. It is actually not just that it makes me less unhappy; it actually makes me actively happier. It's as if some huge weight is rolled off me, not to read the opinions of others, and I can quite understand why others wouldn't want to read the opinions of me, and they don't have to, and that's the beauty of it. Is let's not. But there is a sort of, I think, Wilde understood, but there's a sort of furious anger in a certain class of journalists that they're not being heard. Even though they have access to every one of their readers, the fact that someone else isn't listening or isn't paying attention drives them slightly potty, and they actually want to bellow their malice into the ear of the person to whom it's directed. And if they felt that person wasn't getting it, it would really annoy them, because they want to hurt. They actually want to hurt people. And that's unfortunate. I just don't want to be a part of it. And the thing was, I was a part of it. I'm really not speaking of some giant noble spirit who is easily wounded and must be sympathised with. I was a journalist or at least a columnist, which is what my objections. I had no objection with news gatherers. I was a columnist for several years for the Daily Telegraph in England, which is the most successful sells the most copies at least of the broadsheets of the serious newspapers. And I could see how easy it was to become this poisoned figure, because there is nothing easier than writing an article against something. It's just so simple. It writes itself. You've just got to be angry about something. You've just got to puff and wheeze with indignation and fury and resentment and bile and malice, and the thing writes itself. And if you write anything that's for something, it looks sentimental and cutesy and so much harder to write. It's so much harder to write well. So all the successful columnists, certainly in British press, are vicious, and they're good at being vicious, and it's admirable. And if you share their politics, mostly their viciousness is something you can applaud. If you don't, then you just call them beasts and animals and revolting, and it just gets so annoying. It's such a pity. And that's one of the reasons I love the online world, is that although that exists in abundance, you can choose absolutely which part of the online world you want to live in. You can make your own kingdom in that sense. So things like Twitter or whatever, I'm sure there are all kinds of Twitter, clusters of people who have politics that I would find horrific, and religious views that I would find preposterous and impertinent. But I just don't have to follow them, and I can block them, and I will never know they exist, and that's glorious. And similarly, as long as you don't lower your eyes when reading a blog, as long as you don't go down to the comment section where the trolls lurk, where the viciousness is, because that's, there really is just suppurating, boiling seas of acid, where if you just so much as dip a toe, you've lost your limbs, just vileness abounding. Again, it's this resentment. I will be heard, and I not only will I be heard, I will offend, I will tear, I will lacerate, I will wound. I want the sensibilities of anyone who disagrees with me to be bruised beyond mending. That kind of attitude is very strong on the net, and for all that we can be advocates for the glory and the democracy that exists online, we must be aware too that dark side of humanity that just needs to be heard and can't bear people like me, for example, who have access to greater numbers of followers on Twitter or whose website gets more hits. And the more they see that, the more the web becomes a reflection of their view of the meanness and wrongness of society, where some people get it all and others get none, then the more bitterness there is. And I think it's difficult, because I don't certainly want there to be an aristocracy on the net. I don't want there to be that. I think that the whole beauty of it at its best is that there is genuine equality and genuine reciprocity between a Twitterer and his or her followers, or between a blogger and their readers, and that it's not an audience going to one site that is permanent and stable and is like the equivalent of the old models of the broadcaster, but that it's much more fluid, and the broadcaster becomes the broadcasted to, the TV station becomes the audience, and as long as people believe that, and behave as if that's true, then there's real hope in the way information is going. Who was my first love? Well, I shan't give you his name because that's unkind. And he's married and has children, and I wouldn't want to embarrass his children. But I've given him various names in novels and in books. Like a lot of first loves, certainly first loves for sensitive people such as I was then. I guess I have what Martin Amis called the primary writer's arrogance of assuming that my experiences are common to everyone else's experiences. Sometimes it is true. Mostly one hopes it's true, and therefore that's what one likes in a writer. You think, oh, I feel that too. Just occasionally you might express a feeling and everyone goes, what? Then it's very embarrassing. But I'm assuming that most people, their first love when they're a teenage, that unbelievable hole that opens up inside them of longing and yearning, of pain, of joy, that huge, great bundle of toxic emotions allied to beauty and opening out into nature and to glory and suddenly connecting you with every love poet and every love song ever written, that explosion in my head and heart will never be matched. You can never hope to recapture the first fine careless rapture, as the poet put it. But it stays with you, like a good acid trip. You get a little flashback every now and again. It'll never leave you. It teaches you to look at things differently and to feel things differently. It educates your soul, if you like. All first love is unrequited, ultimately, because it's so huge. It's such an act of giving, and it requires so much back that it can never be given back. And indeed, you wouldn't necessarily want it given back. It is like an atom bomb. It is like all the energy of who you are and who you want to be and what you love and what you hope to be explodes, and it is impossible for a single human being to offer that back to you in a mutual way. It would be like matter meeting antimatter. It's sort of almost important that what you do is worship and yearn and long. But so that was, to me, of course, the single most important thing in my life. And occasionally I get dreams and I'm back there again, and I'm still as trembly as ever I was. And I get, because I've written about it, I get emails and Twitters, whatever, from people in their adolescence who are going through the same thing and saying, oh, how do I cope? And I read your book and it's the same for me, and it is the same for me, and he'll never look at me, she'll never look at me. What can I do? I'll make a fool of myself. Should I write them a poem? And what if they reject me? And oh my God. And I read that and I also weep at these vast sagas, these romantic sagas that are played out in every school, in every village, in every town, in every country in the world it's going on. There's all this mass of emotional energy just spreading outwards, and some of it ends terribly unhappily. So, the only thing that saddens me is that I suppose the default community attitude of kids is to suppress it and to smother it and to pretend it isn't there and to be ashamed of it. Not because it's transgressive, because it's gay necessarily. It's just as problematical if it's straight. It's nothing to do with that. But because the schoolyard attitude is that you don't talk about these things. There's no, you feel all this emotion, but the language for it is forbidden. Really, you just don't do it. Unless, I think girls are probably better at it, and maybe the online community helps with it. Chat rooms and things, you can express yourself. But generally speaking, boys at 15, 16 are much more interested in sport, or even if they're not more interested in sport and their soul is yearning, they're not going to say it. And if only they could, it would be good.